Okay, 5 minutes, 55 seconds, 1,100 words. Let's light this candle. Okay, I stand before you today in the traditional ceremonial robes of the modern researcher, caffeine, imposter syndrome, and lanyard. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my positionality. I'm speaking to you as a white male, low middle class, Midlands born, second generation, comprehensive school attending, mildly sleep deprived teacher researcher located somewhere between critical theory and £3.85 meal deal. Shit. £4.25. I forgot. I recognise that my perspective has been shaped by systems of power, student evaluations, and a supervisor who once wrote interesting in the track changes, which we all know is academia's version of being shot in the abdomen. I acknowledge the colonial history of the university, which was built upon extraction, exclusion, and suffering, and now also a costly coffee where a muffin costs more than a meal deal. I further acknowledge that knowledge itself is situated, contingent, unstable, and pending rep assessment, because in academia, nothing can simply be anymore. You can't just study frogs. No, you must first explain your relationship to frogs. Growing up, I always felt adjacent to amphibious discourse. You can't analyse Shakespeare without first confessing your ontological crimes. While I have not personally been Hamlet, I recognise my methodological proximities, melancholic masculinities, and every paper now begins like a hostage video. Before proceeding, the author wishes to acknowledge their inherent limitations. Mate, you're writing about spreadsheets, and we all do it, because somewhere along the line we took a perfectly reasonable idea of people's experiences, shaped their perspectives, and stretched it like cheap, clean film over the entire intellectual universe. Now, every conference presentation starts with 15 minutes of autobiographical weather forecasting, and there's always that one academic who speaks entirely in theoretical incantations, summoning dead Frenchmen like a necromancer with staff discounts through a Deleuzian Lefebvrean lens of rhizomatic liminality. So, the question was, where's the toilet? And academia has guilt warned the Catholic Church because guilt sounds intelligent, confidence is suspicious, clarity is fascism, and positionality statements grow longer and longer and longer and longer because nobody wants to be caught standing naked without sufficient caveats. So we build armour from self-awareness. I'm biased, I'm flawed, I'm situated. I'm implicated, I'm reflective, I'm critically engaged, I'm deeply aware that my understanding of traffic congestion has been mediated through neoliberal temporal infrastructures. You got stuck on the M6, Darren, that's what happened. But here's the thing, buried under the performance, underneath the ritual apology dance, there's a beautiful idea, a necessary one, because knowledge does come from somewhere. Okay, fine. Experience matters, who speaks matters, who gets cited matters, who gets funded matters, who quietly leaves academia burned out of 32 with nothing to show for it, potential, whatever that means matters. But somewhere between humility and intellectual performance art, we lost the plot. Academia, the only profession where saying I don't know is admirable, but saying I know requires 42 citations, 3 theoretical frameworks, and a blood sacrifice of Foucault. And still, despite the jargon, the conferences and windowless hotels, the passive-aggressive peer reviews written in the tone of a Victorian divorce letter, there remains something weirdly hopeful about rooms like this, full of exhausted humans trying to understand the world before the funding runs out. There is something beautiful about people who still believe that thought matters more than a well-engineered prompt fed to a poorly conceived machine. So yes, acknowledge your positionality, interrogate your assumptions, recognise the structures around you, but also, for the love of God, occasionally say something a normal person can understand. Because if your theory of liberation requires a glossary and an enigma machine and 6 months of reading groups, the revolution will be peer-reviewed long before it's televised. Perhaps I should follow my own advice. Here goes nothing. Here goes nothing. Within epistemology, reflecting ontologically provisional, I locate myself as we all must inside a paradigm that may or may not be having an identity crisis. Methodologically pluralistic is commitment is difficult. I gesture carefully toward phenomenology, praxeology, axiology, just enough ology to establish credibility without risking clarity. And somewhere between teleology and atheology, I was mixed up, but no one stops me. There emerges not a method, not quite a paradigm, but a methodological paradigm of paradigmatic methodologies, which if you think about it, and I strongly advise that you don't, reveals an underlying meta-epistemology of recursive ontology that collapses elegantly into a tautology that we all agree not to notice, because the paradigm is what we understand and the methodology is not asking. And so, having mapped the terrain and thoroughly deconstructed my own complicity, I arrive visibly exhausted at the precipice of a contribution that may or may not actually exist. Thematically saturated because the deadline was yesterday, I gesture expansively toward future directions, policy implications, transformative horizons, just enough conceptual smoke to obscure the terrifying fact that no data was actually gathered. No participants were ever interviewed, and the spreadsheets are just empty cells staring back at me in the dark. Shit, I forgot to collect any data. And somewhere between the lack of a sample size, the complete absence of any fieldwork, and a complete fear of peer review, I'll ask the USB-C in April, but the abstract was already submitted, there emerges not quite a breakthrough, not a finding, but a magnificent justification for why I cannot tell you anything at all, which, if you consider the metrics, and the VC, if we still had one, would insist that we do, reveals an underlying systemic insufficiency of recursive limitations that dissolves profitably into an institutional requirement we can all agree to fund again next year. We have deconstructed the discourse with decentralised focus. We've spent the entire budget on artisan pastries, for a symposium entitled Towards Reimagining the Possibility of Rethinking Complexity. And after innumerable keynote speakers and an unfortunate incident involving a flip chart and an existential crisis, we have concluded that the issue is far too nuanced to be understood without additional funding, because the only finding is the gap in the literature remains, the landscape is unmapped, the silence is deafening, the horizon recedes at the speed of tenure, therefore additional funding is necessary, further conferences in Oslo are necessary, another 3-year longitudinal study is vital, not to answer the question of course, but to continue interrogating its complexity. I'll take questions, but I hope no one's here looking for answers.